Now I want to introduce Warren Mundine. Warren's a tremendously important leader in the true sense of the word in Aboriginal Australia. He has a local reach and a national reach and an international reach. He hails from the Bundjalung and Gumbaynggirr people of New South Wales. He comes from an enormously large family. I'm running into Mundines all over the country. Huge fan of Anthony, by the way. And, you know, these North Coast New South Wales people, they've been involved in this game for a very long time. And I remember years ago meeting that great leader, Frank Roberts, and he was very inspiring. So what Warren figured out early on was that, you know, we need to be part of the action. And he's had a unique way of convincing people that Aboriginal people need to be part of the economy. He was the president of the ALP, of the Australian Labor Party, for a time. He set up the Aboriginal Chamber of Commerce in New South Wales, and he remains the chairman of that. And he is now the, he has been also the director of the Native Title Services of New South Wales. So he's been responsible for those incredibly interesting native title settlements and deals in New South Wales. And his new position is as director of Generation 1, and I'll leave it to him to explain that to you. And so it's really great to have you here again, Warren, and to hear yet again your advocacy for Aboriginal employment and participation in the economy.
Thanks for that. Yes, we are a pretty large family, the Mundines, and of course, for all those people who heard that Mundine was talking today, and thought that Anthony was turning up, I can see the confusion because we have that similar Mundine physical physique and boxing paras. Anyway, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we are meeting on here today, the Gumatji, and to pay my respect to the elders past and present, particularly the elders that are here today. I would also like to acknowledge my own Bundjalung and Gumbaynggirr elders as well. What I'm going to talk about is a number of things. First, I'm going to go through is Generation 1, explain what Generation 1 is and what we do and what we want to achieve. And also then I'll expand into that, into some of you may have seen some recent articles I put out to the Australian and also to the Australian Financial Review, looking at the way forward for Indigenous communities and that. In fact, over the next few months, the next few weeks, I'll be putting articles into the Australian Fin Review that we're putting out challenges about how we look at developing the North, how we look at getting commercial activities and economic activities and commercial activities more focused into Indigenous communities, and how we can move forward as a people, and how does that benefit Australia and Australia as a whole as it operates in the new global world, as it changes and shifts with all the interesting things that are happening. Look, you know, Mel started off the conversation in regard to the mining industry. We all know about the mining industry and the boom that's been happening over a number of years, and there's the interesting conversation about that boom at the moment that we're having, whether the boom's going to continue or not, or whether this is a blip on the stage and how we move forward. The thing is that the important thing is that the wealth that it has offered, the industry has offered the country as a whole and the individuals involved in it. When I think of the mining, I think of the wealth that it offers, but I also think of the opportunities it offers Indigenous Australians who have also had a choice and the opportunity for wealth, employment and economic development. A couple of months ago, I took on the role as, in fact, late June, as CEO of Generation 1. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the work of Generation 1, but those who are not, I would like to give you some background to that. Generation 1, and so in fact some of our important partners are sitting in the audience here. Generation 1 aims to bring all Australians together to end the disparity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians in one generation. in our generation, and hence the very clever name Generation 1. It is also to shift Indigenous people from being welfare dependent and make it redundant and make us part of the wider Australian and global economy and to move us forward. And we believe that by highlighting and supporting the pathway to employment, education, training and mentoring, specifically education that builds a foundation for life, training specific for a guaranteed job, and Mel talked about that earlier and I'll expand upon that a bit more, employment that is sustainable and empowers the individual, as well as mentoring that supports this pathway along. Generation 1 aims to shift attitudes, giving all Australians a chance to make a difference. And so so far we have 250,000 members, and they have joined us in this movement we call Movement for Change. The interesting statistic of that 255,000 members is that 30% of our membership is under the age of 21, so very young, hence why they appointed me. And and we're also, 15% of our membership is Indigenous. So we're looking at well in excess of something like 40,000 members of the Generation 1 are Indigenous people. So that would probably make us, our organisation, one of the largest Indigenous membership organisations in the country. And we work very closely with that membership and how we operate with that membership. Employment may not change everything, but without it, nothing will change. The Indigenous rate of unemployment, as we all know, is constantly 3 times higher than the non-Indigenous rate. For employment and the hope of employment, we can demonstrate the value of the career path, which starts with education, training, entry-level employment, and then career progression. Generation 1's focus on breaking down stereotypes by just demonstrating the diversity and the success of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians who are achieving economic independence while ensuring their culture is understood and respected. 2 very important points. Generation 1 was set up to motivate and inspire all Australians to take action, as this is no longer just a government issue or an issue for Indigenous people. It is an Australian issue. Launched in 2008 with Prime Minister Kevin Rudd as with a freeway commitment, the Australian Employment Covenant, which forms part of the Generation 1, aimed to build the demand for an Indigenous workforce by committing 50,000 sustainable jobs. When that announcement was made, I was there at the time with Noel Pearson, myself and Andrew Forrest and Kevin Rudd. A lot of people said, gee, 50,000 jobs, how are you going to get 50,000 jobs? As we know from looking at the statistics around the country, you're looking at the mining industry, you look at the IT industry, you look at the agricultural industry, which is struggling for workers, you've got well in excess of over 100,000 jobs just off those 3 industries I just mentioned. And so you're looking at, when you start adding other industries in, and you see the struggle for skilled workers in Australia as we look overseas for workers, we're in excess of probably 200,000 jobs we need today. So the argument for me wasn't the figure of 50,000 jobs. I knew we could get that figure. The argument for me was in regard to how we got bums on seats, people into those jobs. To date, the Australian Employment Covenant has secured over 62,000 job commitments from 330 employers from 17 industries across Australia, and some of those industries are here in this room, and I'd like to congratulate you and thank you for the work that you've done in this area and come along this path with us. This is an interesting thing about this, and this is what we're on about, and we're stepping away from government and doing it ourselves, Indigenous people doing it, and non-government agencies and industries doing it, is this is an employer-driven initiative. So it's driven by the employers that is helping create a sea change within Australian businesses who commit to employing Indigenous people as part of their workforce development strategies. The Australian Employment Covenant state managers work with employers to develop the Covenant action plans, which outline how employers will meet their commitments and what skill sets employers are looking for when advertising for vacancies. The Australian Employment Covenant has driven the demand for an Indigenous workforce. along, and I acknowledge this, along with a number of other large corporations within Australia, and we look at the long track record of Rio Tinto, and I praise them for their work, and other industries as well. However, this has exposed the major supply-side barriers. So far, 10,600 Indigenous Australians have taken up jobs with the Australian Employment Covenant employers. However, for every one job that is filled, it is estimated that 2 jobs go unfilled. Despite large job commitments through the Australian Employment Covenant, employers are having difficulty connecting with job and work-ready candidates suitable for their businesses. Identifying those responsible for providing support is often complicated, and there is a grey area between the roles of business, government, employment service providers and the education and training systems. Generation 1 undertook extensive consultation in 2011 with communities across Australia and have developed what we call the Vocational Training and Employment Policy, Vocational Training and Employment Centres Policy. Generation 1 undertook extensive consultation and developed this policy of skills and training for a career path. 4 things we looked at in regard to this is skills and training for a career, best practice case studies, walk in my shoes, which is a quantitative survey of employers' experiences from the perspective of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, raising Indigenous workforce participation, which is scoping studies on improving data collection and understanding effective labour market interventions. Interesting thing for me, if you Google Indigenous employment studies and statistics, you'll be bombarded with millions of reports. The interesting thing about it is that through all these reports you really can't get the actual proper data on where we stand with Indigenous employment. It's bloody difficult to get through it. In our Walk in My Shoes report, Indigenous Experiences of Barriers and Drivers in the Employment Cycle, Indigenous job seekers are also frustrated because training does not necessarily lead to jobs. Many reports being ashamed and embarrassed by their lack of education, literacy and work readiness. Many are haunted by criminal records from the past. An unemployed woman in Sydney said to us, I'll name a couple of quotes, "A job means independence and also self-esteem and stability. I could show my kids this in what I can do. Doesn't matter whether you're black or white, I can get out and do it." Another employed person said, you can do 50,000 certificates and you still are not going to get a job. Or another one from the Coffs Harbour area said, all the jobs that I wanted to apply for, they wouldn't even look at me. I'd go for the interview and that's it. I would never hear from them again. My police record followed me for everywhere I went. The issue for me, and one of the things that I've known from my background of working in the gas industry and building pipelines around Australia, was that we'd go into Aboriginal communities to get employment and you'd meet people who had more certificates plastered on their walls than a Harvard law professor, but none of them actually got a job out of it. So these are the things that we've got to start doing around. The Vocational Training and Employment Centres, or VTEC as we say, policy will ensure that employers have access to job and work-ready candidates, and Indigenous job seekers have access to effective, supportive pathways from disadvantage to employment and careers. The most important feature is that local industries and employers work in partnership with Indigenous people in their communities, and that governments, service providers and educational and training providers support and enable that partnership. Emphasis on support and enable that partnership. The VTEC framework would ensure that candidates undertake employment-directed training for the job that is available within the organisation, and that candidates have a sound understanding of the formal and informal rules of the workplace from day one of the employment. The model includes the job is the anchor. One of the problems we have with training for the last 40 years is that we bring people in, we train them, and we hope that there's a job at the end of the day for them. In this process, we're saying we start the reverse. It's the job that is the anchor, line of sight to employment, holistic support, break down barriers, and network with existing services. So you look at, we have a diagram which you can have a look at later. We look at personal support, we look at training, we look at VTEC services, we look at housing, we look at transport, and we look at health, and these are centred all around a job. The framework would differ depending on the community needs, so you need to cater for the community and regional differences. However, VTECs must include community and support and engagement, personal support and holistic care, including working with health services such as the Aboriginal Medical Service, accommodation and mental illness, work and life skills, basic literacy and numeracy to operate in the workplace, financial literacy, driver's licence, transport, logistics support, importantly, an understanding the formal and informal rules of the workplace, employer-directed training that meets the needs of the employer who is providing the opportunity, preferably in a real job setting, in fact must be in a real job setting, a real job with post-placement support. Monitoring is vital to support the new employee and resolve misunderstandings and issues that arise. Mentors can be in three main forms: buddies, qualified mentors or community mentors. Cultural awareness is important. Career progression, entry-level job support, the initial transition into employment, but to break the cycle of welfare dependency and to career progression are all important for these things to happen. One of the things I want to focus on is we're not just talking about in an academic or an airy-fairy type area. We're actually talking about real things. And I'll give you some statistics. Statistically, the VTEC speaks for itself. Since it was, and this is a particular VTEC that we're looking at in regard to FMG, Fortescue's Metal Group, it was established in 2006. The Vocational Training and Employment Centre has supported over 1,000 people with training and driver's licences. 588 Aboriginal people have graduated from the VTEC program. There are currently 422 Aboriginal people employed by Fortescue's and 630 Aboriginal people employed by their contractors. That's 10% of the Fortescue's workforce is Aboriginal. The other interesting part about that, when you go to the wharfs, the loading and offloading of the wharfs, 30% of the wharf staff is Indigenous. I'd like to introduce you to, because we have some of the participants in the program, and we have Patrick over here. He'd like to stand up and come forward. Is here with me today, and he participated in the VTEC program for 6 weeks and had an 8-day certificate too. You want to come at the top? A certificate in surface extraction courses in South Headland. He is now employed at the Cloudbreak operations as an operator, driving dump trucks. And I'd like to, Patrick, if you're not too shy, to come forward and tell us a little bit about your story.
Yeah, hello people. Yeah, I used to live in Kalgoorlie for 30 years. I've been working around in Kalgoorlie for a while and went back to Rowan, Headland, where my mother's country. And I run into BTECs, had a little program going there for Indigenous people to train them up. So I said, oh yeah, so you put my name down, and so it got me there for a year now. Been on F&G working as a dump truck driver. So yeah, I hope I'll still be there. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Patrick. And there's many other case studies. If you go to the Generation 1 website, one of the things that we like to do and we insist upon is talking about people's stories. So it's not about Warren Mundine or Andrew Forrest or someone else standing up here and talking and arguing, debating about these things. You actually see real people whose lives and careers and their paths have changed by the simple focus of getting a job. And job does make changes in people's lives. For myself, and I didn't get here in a vacuum. It was because around 1900 my grandfather got a job in the rural industry. He was a labourer, a worker, and that was in the cattle industry. It wasn't a pretty job, it was a tough job, it wasn't very good wages, but he got up at 5 a.m. every morning, went to work, and come home at 4 p.m. and handed money over to my grandmother. My grandmother then fed, clothed and sent the kids off to school. My father's generation grew up thinking that was normal, that you worked or you got educated. So when he left school, he went out, got up at 5 a.m, got a job, went to work, came home at 4 p.m, handed money over to my mother. My mother then got out and fed us, clothed us and sent us to school. So myself and my siblings grew up thinking that was normal. So when I left school, I went out and got a job. In the good old days when I used to get up at 5 a.m. and come home at 4 p.m, I wish they were still around. 7 days a week, 24 hours. I got up and go to work, and then my ex-wife, I used to come home and give her some of my money, which is probably why she's my ex-wife, and then she used to feed the kids and clothe them and send us to work. And so my kids grew up thinking that was normal. So in my kids' world, there's this idea of not working and not getting an education or both at the same time is just not in their world. And that's just because the simple process of my grandfather getting a job, working on a cattle station, working pretty bloody hard, as a lot of people know what cattle stations are like, and for little low wages, but that changed 4 generations of my family. And that's probably why Marcia runs into Mundines all over the place doing a wide range of different things. But that leads on to another thing which is very important, and that is that if we're really going to, besides this change of employment, I'm sick and tired, and this is my little soapbox before I finish, I'm a bit sick and tired of politicians and other people standing up and saying, look, there's no real economic reason for Aboriginal communities to exist in remote areas, so they should be closed. I'm a bit bored and sick and tired of hearing those type of talks. For one, we live in a free and democratic society and people can live where they bloody well like. 2, through Aboriginal culture and their life, they are tied to their country and they have beliefs in their country, and that's why they live there and they thrive in there. What we need to do as a society is really start looking about how we can get economic development happening within these communities, and they can. I just went to Arakan only a week or so ago, and I seen, everyone said, when we first got there, I said, people were telling me they should just close the place. When I left that community and I had conversations with people like Jerry Harvey and a number of other business people, we saw opportunity. We saw an Indigenous community that could thrive commercially and things could happen. It's just that through government controls and people's ignorance about how Aboriginal people should live and what they should do, that they're forcing communities into these areas. We need to take a more proactive approach, look at economic development and look at about how we can get sustainable commercial activity happening, which then leads on to real jobs and making these communities more palatable for the people who live in there and more sustainable into the future. On that I'll leave it. We're happy for questions and answers. We love questions. If you've got the answers, we'll even love that too. Thank you.